A single confession whispered at midnight, too late to save a life. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axen. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your words always brighten the mystery. Let's begin. At 9:10 on a Wednesday evening, the lounge of the Rose and Crown in Flaxborough was unusually quiet. A few regulars lingered by the bar, their elbows making faint, rhythmic squeaks against the polished wood. Mrs. Thistlethwaite, who had once presided over the Women's Institute but was now mostly occupied with supervising other people's morals, sat rigidly near the hearth with a glass of sherry and an expression that suggested she was waiting for something disagreeable to happen. It did. A man, thin, pale, with the sort of nervous mustache that seldom survived long in Flaxborough, entered, looked around as though the walls were listening, and ordered a gin. The barmaid, Miss Frobisher, hesitated. "You all right, Mr. Hargreaves?" she asked. Mr. Hargreaves nodded once, though not convincingly. "I'll just have the one," he said, in the tone of a man making a final statement to a judge. He drank it quickly. Then, with a small, shuddering breath, he set the glass down and said distinctly, though not loudly, "I've killed someone." There was a pause in which even the clock over the dartboard seemed to think twice about ticking. "Don't be daft, Leonard," said Mr. Goff, the town surveyor, after a moment. "You've only ever killed time." But Hargreaves was not smiling. He looked at them all, Mrs. Thistlethwaite, Miss Frobisher, Mr. Goff, with a sort of desolate sincerity. "No," he said. "It's true." Then, as though exhausted by the declaration, he turned and walked unsteadily out into the night. For perhaps 30 seconds, no one moved. Then Mrs. Thistlethwaite rose in moral indignation disguised as public duty. "Miss Frobisher," she said, "you had better call the police." Constable Parkin's report. Constable Parkin arrived 15 minutes later, his notebook already open and his pencil already broken. "He said what, exactly?" he asked, as though accuracy in transcription might later prove to be his defense. "Word for word," Mrs. Thistlethwaite said. "I've killed someone. I have an excellent memory for these things." "Indeed you do," murmured Mr. Goff, "though not always a sense of proportion." Parkin wrote industriously. "Did he mention who or where?" "No, but I've always said there was something not quite right about Mr. Hargreaves. That greenhouse of his, for example. All those late nights. You can't tell me cucumbers need attention after midnight." Inspector Purbright arrives. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Purbright had made his gentle, unhurried way to the Rose and Crown. He listened to the retelling of events with his usual air of polite disbelief. "Mr. Hargreaves?" he said thoughtfully. "That would be Leonard Hargreaves of the Municipal Accounts Office." "That's the one," said Goff. "Lives up by St. Luke's. Bit quiet, but reliable enough. Wouldn't say boo to a ledger." Purbright nodded. "And yet he has apparently confessed to murder." "It's probably just drink," suggested Miss Frobisher, though she sounded more hopeful than certain. Purbright smiled faintly. "Drink has confessed to many things, Miss Frobisher, but seldom to murder." He looked toward the door. Outside, the town's street lamps shimmered weakly through a thin mist. Somewhere, a dog barked with unnecessary conviction. "Still," said Purbright, reaching for his hat, "we ought to see if Mr. Hargreaves is at home. One never knows what people may have done, or think they've done, after closing time." A house in order, Leonard Hargreaves lived in a small semi-detached house, the sort of place that was proud of its lace curtains and terrified of its electricity bill. When Purbright and Parkin arrived, the lights were on and the door unlocked. Hargreaves was sitting at his kitchen table, hands folded, a cup of tea untouched before him. "I was expecting you," he said simply. "I thought it best." Purbright regarded him with mild curiosity. "About what, Mr. Hargreaves?" The man swallowed. "About the woman. I didn't mean to. But she wouldn't listen." "Which woman would that be?" Hargreaves looked bewildered. "You don't know. I thought everyone would by now." Purbright shook his head slowly. "Not yet, Mr. Hargreaves. Perhaps you'd like to tell us." But Hargreaves didn't answer. Instead, his gaze wandered to the window where the lace curtain fluttered slightly in the draught. He smiled faintly, a sad, resigned little smile, and said, "You'll find out soon enough." Then he fainted clean away. Aftermath of an evening by midnight, Dr. Glendower had revived Hargreaves and declared it a simple case of nervous exhaustion complicated by guilt, real or imagined. The inspector accepted this diagnosis without argument. Outside, the mist had thickened into something that muffled even the clatter of the milk lorry. Purbright stood by the gate, hands in his pockets, watching the faint glow from the kitchen window. Constable Parkin shuffled beside him. "Do you think he really has, sir?" Purbright tilted his head slightly. "Killed someone?" "Possibly. But I rather think the interesting question, Parkin, is who believes he has?" He smiled again. That quiet, almost apologetic smile that in Flaxborough often preceded trouble of the most respectable kind. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall listen to what the town has to say. It's usually wrong, but often usefully so." The next morning, with Flaxborough already in a state of refined agitation, the news that Leonard Hargreaves had confessed to murder was circulating with such vigor that by 8 o'clock it had become, depending on the narrator, either a cold-blooded strangling, a crime of passion, or an act of long-delayed justice against a nameless wrongdoer. The Rose and Crown itself was enjoying an unprecedented breakfast trade, as early patrons came not for drink, but for confirmation. Miss Frobisher, whose recollection of events grew more dramatic with each repetition, was cornered by 3 members of the Ladies' Bridge Club demanding the exact tone of his voice and whether his hands had been shaking. "He was pale," she said, enjoying the weight of their expectation, "and his voice, it had that hollow sort of sound, like someone confessing in church." Mrs. Thistlethwaite, who had now claimed proprietorship over the incident, interrupted. "He was quite calm, I assure you. That's what made it so dreadful. Quite calm, like a man already resigned to the gallows." She added this with a relish she would later call compassion. By 11 o'clock, the matter had reached the barber shop, where Mr. Crome, the proprietor, was asserting to a captive audience that Hargreaves had been odd for years. He had, Mr. Crome insisted, once ordered a short back and sides on a Tuesday and then not returned for 6 months, proof enough of disturbed tendencies. Meanwhile, at the municipal offices, colleagues whispered in corridors, speculating with bureaucratic precision about whom he might have killed. "He always had trouble with Mrs. Vane from typing," one clerk murmured. "She never balanced her vouchers properly. Perhaps she pushed him too far." "More likely himself," said another, lowering his voice. "The way he goes on about loneliness, it's not natural." By noon, Mrs. Hockley at the post office had heard from a reliable cousin that a woman's body had been found in a greenhouse. This, though entirely untrue, lent the story a satisfying symmetry. When Inspector Purbright arrived at the station shortly before lunch, the desk sergeant's face carried the gleeful tension of a man barely restraining gossip. "Town's in quite a state, sir," he said. "They've got him guilty of everything from poisoning to pushing someone off the viaduct." Purbright removed his coat with leisurely precision. "I suppose the only thing they're not yet certain of," he said mildly, "is whether the victim existed." He spent the early afternoon in his office, going over what little was known. Leonard Hargreaves, age 42, accounts clerk, unmarried, modest habits, no known enemies, no history of violence. His confession had been spontaneous, unprovoked, and so far uncorroborated by any missing persons report. The doctor's examination had confirmed nervous collapse, but nothing physically alarming. Purbright's instinct, though he rarely named such things aloud, told him that, if a crime existed, it was likely one of embarrassment rather than blood. Around 3 o'clock, he sent Constable Parkin to make quiet inquiries along St. Luke's Terrace. Parkin's progress was methodical but conspicuous. His idea of discretion was to question every visible neighbor in turn. By tea-time, he returned with a notebook full of remarks. Mrs. Dacres at number 7 says he was a pleasant enough man, though she thought it peculiar that he always polished his door-knocker after dark. Mr. Codd at number 9 says he used to see Hargreaves carrying parcels into the shed late at night. Couldn't say what was in them, mind, but thought it suspicious. Purbright listened, his expression mild but inwardly amused. Mr. Codd would think a sunrise suspicious if it arrived unannounced, he said. Parkin frowned at his notes. Oh, and Mrs. Dacres mentioned something else, sir. Said she heard a woman's voice at his house last week. Loud argument, she thought. Purbright's eyes rested on the constable. Did she recognize the voice? No, sir. Just said it wasn't one of the neighbors. Too refined, she thought. Possibly from the better end of town. Purbright leaned back. Interesting. Thank you, Parkin. That will do for now. When the constable had gone, the inspector sat for some minutes, gazing at the muted street outside. Flaxborough lay in its usual late afternoon calm, a faint smell of coal smoke, a milk cart rattling in the distance, the town's narrow respectability folded neatly over its little scandals. Somewhere among them, he thought, was a reason for Hargreaves's extraordinary statement. That evening he returned to St. Luke's Terrace. The street lamps were just coming on, their glow dissolving in a thin drizzle. Hargreaves's house looked much as it had the previous night, neat, resigned, faintly guilty of its own tidiness. Inside, the man was sitting again at his table, now wrapped in a dressing gown. His face was drawn, but calmer. Feeling better? Purbright asked gently. A little, though I'd rather not, if that makes sense. Perfectly, Purbright said. He sat down opposite him. You said something last night about a woman who wouldn't listen. Do you remember? Hargreaves's hands tightened. Yes, but I'd prefer not to talk about it yet. I understand. Still, if someone's in danger, you'd wish to prevent it, wouldn't you? There's no danger now, Hargreaves said quietly. It's done. Purbright regarded him, saying nothing. The silence stretched until Hargreaves sighed and looked up. I didn't mean to frighten them at the pub. It was just the guilt. I had to say it aloud. Sometimes confession can relieve the mind, Purbright murmured, though it can also confuse the police. Hargreaves gave a faint smile. Then I apologize, Inspector. You'll understand soon enough. As Purbright left the house, the drizzle had thickened into steady rain. He paused under his umbrella, thinking. There was something oddly deliberate about Hargreaves' manner, like a man performing penance rather than seeking absolution. The inspector made a small note to himself to check missing person reports, not only locally, but across the county. As he turned down the road, a figure approached, a woman in a brown raincoat hurrying past with her head down. Purbright might not have noticed her at all had she not glanced up just once. Her face was pale, intent, and unmistakably watchful. She crossed to the opposite pavement when she saw the inspector. Purbright stopped, looking after her as she disappeared into the damp shimmer of the streetlights. Perhaps, he thought, the town's gossip had not yet reached its most interesting participant. The following morning dawned grey and reluctant, as though the sky itself had taken note of Flaxborough's unease and decided to keep its counsel. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual, for he disliked the kind of excitement that too much speculation produced among his subordinates. Constable Parkin had already made tea and was attempting, with painful discretion, not to mention the woman in the brown raincoat. His resolve lasted until the second cup. "Funny thing, sir," he began. There was someone hanging about Mr. Hargreaves' street last night after you left. Mrs. Dacre said she saw her too. Same raincoat, same sort of walk. She thought the woman looked familiar, but couldn't place her. Purbright stirred his tea slowly, watching the thin swirl of milk spread outward like a thought forming. Did Mrs. Dacres mention what time she saw her? About 9:30, sir. Said the woman stood near the post box for several minutes, then walked off toward the vicarage. Purbright nodded, apparently absorbed by his tea. The vicarage, you say? He put down the spoon and looked up mildly. Would you be good enough to have a word with Reverend Nibbleswick this morning? Ask as tactfully as you can whether any ladies of mysterious bearing have lately taken to haunting his path. Parkin brightened at the assignment, saluted with unnecessary energy, and departed. Left alone, Purbright turned to the day's post. Among the usual circulars and reports lay a thin envelope bearing the crest of the county constabulary. Inside was a typed note confirming that no missing person had been reported matching any recent incident in Flaxborough or neighboring towns. There was, in short, no known victim. Yet the confession had the uncomfortable weight of sincerity. He took up his hat again and decided that a visit to Mr. Hargreaves' place of work might prove enlightening. At the municipal offices, a faint air of moral infection lingered, as though the staff feared guilt might be catching through stationery. When Purbright entered, conversation ceased with such abruptness that the clock's tick became accusatory. Miss Vane, the senior typist, greeted him with the composed briskness of one who relishes proximity to officialdom. "Such an unfortunate business, Inspector," she said. "Mr. Hargreaves always seemed so proper, though I will say he did have his peculiarities." "Indeed." Purbright's tone invited elaboration. "Well," she leaned forward confidentially, "he was very particular about figures. Obsessive, you might say. Once refused to sign off an invoice because of a halfpenny discrepancy. And he did have a tendency to keep to himself. I always thought that kind of solitude unhealthy. Was there ever any lady friend? Someone he might have been concerned about?" Miss Vane drew herself up slightly. "Not that I'm aware of, though he did once receive a letter in violet ink. Perfumed, too." "Ah." Purbright allowed the smallest flicker of amusement. "And did you happen to notice the sender's name?" "Of course not, Inspector," she said with crisp indignation, "but the envelope looked expensive." By the time he left the offices, Purbright had formed a faint outline in his mind. A man given to quiet precision, drawn suddenly into emotional turbulence. The confession might yet prove genuine, but genuine of what? He lunched at the Blue Parrot Cafe, where, between bites of a reluctant shepherd's pie, he overheard two elderly ladies at the next table discuss the matter with impressive authority. "She was older than him, of course," said the first. "They always are in those situations." "Older and richer," replied the other. "I expect," he snapped. "The strain of double-entry bookkeeping would drive anyone to it." Purbright smiled slightly into his napkin. The town was already writing its own novel. All that remained was for him to read between the lines. At 3:00, Parkin returned, soaked from rain but brimming with discovery. "Reverend Nibbleswick says no one's been loitering about the vicarage, sir, but his housekeeper thinks she's seen the lady. Says she's been attending the evening service lately. Sits at the back, leaves before the final hymn." "Did she happen to recall a name?" "No, sir, but she did mention something curious. Said the lady dropped a glove last week. Brown suede. The housekeeper kept it, thinking she might come back for it." Purbright's eyes glimmered. "Ask her to bring it in, will you? And have Miss Teal check whether any local shops recall a recent purchase of that sort." When Parkin had gone again, the inspector allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The pattern, though faint, was emerging. A lonely man, a woman of uncertain background, a confession without a corpse. Somewhere among these was the point where guilt crossed into imagination, or into fact. That evening, He took a quiet walk through the rain-slicked streets. The lamps glowed like weary eyes, and the cobbles shone with an unwholesome honesty. Passing the Rose and Crown, he heard laughter inside, brittle and overbright. The town, he thought, was enjoying its scandal too well. He turned down the lane toward the river, where the air smelled of wet leaves and faint decay. Ahead, a figure moved beneath an umbrella, slight, composed, unmistakably feminine. She hesitated as he approached. "Good evening," Purbright said mildly. "A miserable night for walking." The woman glanced up. It was indeed the same face he had glimpsed before, pale, guarded, the eyes sharp with calculation. "Good evening, Inspector," she replied, not as a stranger but as one expecting him. "You know me, then?" "I knew you would come." Purbright regarded her in the lamplight. "Then perhaps you might tell me why you've taken such an interest in Mr. Hargreaves?" She smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "Interest? Let's call it concern. He's not well." "Indeed, and you would be. Someone who tried to help him once. I didn't succeed." She began to move away, then paused. "If you're looking for what he's confessed to, Inspector, you won't find it in any file or field. It's buried deeper than that." Before he could speak again, she crossed the bridge, her footsteps light but hurried. Purbright watched until she vanished into the mist. He stood for a long while, umbrella tilted against the drizzle, his expression thoughtful. It was not often, he reflected, that someone in Flaxborough made riddles sound personal. The next day began with a hesitant sunlight that failed to make up its mind about shining. Flaxborough's roofs glistened damply, the puddles in Market Square reflecting the spire of St. Luke's with a kind of weary precision. Inspector Purbright, who preferred his mornings without metaphors, arrived at the station to find a Constable Parkin already hovering by his desk, clutching a brown paper parcel with the eagerness of a man who believes he might finally be holding a clue, rather than a complaint. "It's the glove, sir," Parkin announced, "the one the vicar's housekeeper found." Purbright untied the string with the unhurried fingers of a man who had seen too many clues resolve into household trivia. The glove was small, finely stitched, and bore faint traces of perfume. Violets, perhaps. He turned it over, studying the lining, then nodded. "Well made, and old. You see this monogram?" He pointed to the faint embroidery inside the wrist. "E.D. "Could be a name," Parkin suggested. "Elsie? Edith? Emily?" "Or something less obliging," said Purbright. "Still, it narrows the field slightly." He set the glove aside. "Did the housekeeper say whether the lady wore a ring?" "She said she thought so, sir. Noticed it glinting when she dropped the glove." Purbright's eyes narrowed just a little. "Good. That tells us she wasn't trying to hide herself merely, to avoid being remembered too clearly, a distinction often overlooked." Before Parkin could reply, the telephone on the inspector's desk gave a discreet but purposeful ring. Purbright picked it up, listening for several seconds, and his expression did not change, though his tone became brisk. "I see. Yes, of course. Don't touch anything. We'll come immediately." He replaced the receiver and reached for his coat. "They've found something, Parkin, down by the allotments near the river." The allotments were a modest patch of earth divided into ambitions of vegetables and gossip. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the irresistible magnet of municipal excitement. Purbright's arrival caused a murmur of satisfaction. The scene of investigation was now complete. Constable Fincher, who had been guarding the spot, stepped forward. "Morning, sir. Mr. Codd found it while digging up his carrots. Gave him quite a turn." Purbright inclined his head. "People who dig up carrots often get turns, Fincher. What exactly did he find?" "Handbag, sir. Buried shallow-like under the edge of his plot." The handbag was indeed there, half caked with earth but still intact, its clasp stubbornly closed. Purbright lifted it carefully with a handkerchief. "Well," he murmured, "this seems almost too obliging." Inside, the bag contained a compact mirror, a folded handkerchief with an embroidered E, and a small silver locket. The inspector opened the locket. Within was a faded photograph of Leonard Hargreaves, looking slightly younger and considerably less haunted. Parkin whistled softly. So she knew him then? Or wished us to think she did, Purbright replied. A subtle difference, though one the law doesn't always appreciate. He replaced the items with care. Let's see if Mr. Hargreaves can enlighten us before the town supplies its own explanation. By the time they reached St. Luke's Terrace, word of the discovery had already beaten them there. Mrs. Dacres was sweeping her step with ostentatious vigor, and her greeting was both pious and eager. "Oh, Inspector, they're saying there's a body down by the allotments. I said to my sister, mark my words, Leonard Hargreaves will be at the bottom of it. Not literally, of course." Purbright smiled thinly. "Thank you, Mrs. Dacres. You may rest your words unmarked for now." Inside, Hargreaves looked pale but composed. He seemed almost expectant, as though rehearsing for some inevitable reckoning. "We found something that may concern you," Purbright began, placing the handbag on the table. Hargreaves' face drained of what little color it possessed, his eyes fixed on the locket as if it were a living thing. "You found it," he whispered. "I wondered when that would happen." "Would you care to tell me whose it is?" He hesitated, his lips moving silently, then spoke. "It belonged to Evelyn Darnell. I didn't mean to lose it there. I thought it was gone for good." "Miss Darnell," Purbright repeated quietly. "And where is she now?" Hargreaves looked up with a kind of frightened defiance. "Gone. I told you that." "Yes, Mr. Hargreaves, but gone where?" He rubbed his temples, the gesture of a man besieged by the past. "She said she was leaving. I thought she meant for good, not forever. We argued. She wanted money. I wouldn't give it. She said she'd ruin me, tell everyone. I pushed her out. That's all. I swear that's all." Purbright watched him closely. "And after that?" "I didn't see her again." "You didn't follow?" "No." His voice was faint. "But I heard, later, that someone saw her by the river. I thought—" He broke off, staring at the inspector. "You think she's dead?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. "Let's just say it would be convenient for several people if she were." He stood, replacing his hat. "In the meantime, I must ask you not to leave town, though I doubt you'll have much inclination to." As they stepped outside, Parkin exhaled. "He looks guilty enough to hang twice, sir." Purbright glanced at him mildly. "Many innocent men do, Parkin. It saves others the trouble." They walked back toward the station, the late afternoon light fading into drizzle once more. Behind them, the curtains along St. Luke's Terrace twitched like synchronized semaphore. Flaxborough had acquired its scandal. All that remained was for truth, slow, methodical, inconvenient truth, to catch up. That night, as Purbright sat in his office going over his notes, the telephone rang again. Sergeant Lovejoy from the next county sounded sheepish. "Evening, sir. Thought you might like to know. We've had a woman turn up here. Says she's Evelyn Darnell. Bit shaken, but very much alive." Purbright allowed himself a small sigh of satisfaction. "Alive, is she? Excellent. Ask her to stay where she is. I shall be along in the morning." As he hung up, a faint smile touched his lips. Flaxborough's latest tragedy, it seemed, was about to grow rather more complicated than murder. Inspector Purbright set out early the next morning, the first light of dawn turning the wet cobblestones into a map of dull reflections. He drove toward the next county, where the elusive Miss Evelyn Darnell awaited, alive and, according to the message, apparently none the worse for her brush with assumed mortality. The journey took him through stretches of hedged lanes and frost-bitten fields, all gently steaming under a pale sun that looked as if it would rather not interfere. He found her at the small police station in Haversby, sitting neatly upright in a wooden chair. She was younger than he expected, though not young in the way that invited sympathy. Her composure seemed studied, as if she had rehearsed a performance she intended to control. The sergeant on duty, a large man with the good manners of a cow in a parlour, introduced her and discreetly withdrew. Purbright took the seat opposite. "Miss Darnell, I'm Inspector Purbright of Flaxborough. You've caused my town a certain amount of moral exercise these past few days." "I'm sorry," she said, not looking sorry at all. "I didn't realize anyone was looking for me." "Oh, they weren't looking," he said mildly. "They were speculating. It's cheaper." Her lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "And Leonard, is he all right?" "He's in a state of remorse," said Purbright, "which is a useful condition, though it tends to spread confusion. He believes you're dead, you see." Her hands folded on her lap. "He would. Would you care to explain?" She hesitated, then sighed, the sound half weariness, half relief. "We were engaged once, informally. He wanted marriage. I wanted freedom. It seemed an easy decision until he began to act as though I were already his wife. I tried to end it quietly, but Leonard never took endings quietly. He became, well, not violent, but desperate. I left without telling him where I was going." Purbright nodded slightly. "And the handbag?" She looked faintly surprised. "He still had it. I gave it to him the last evening I saw him, told him to keep it safe, that I'd be back for it when things settled. I suppose he thought the worst when I didn't." "Quite the opposite," Purbright said. "He thought the worst had happened." Her expression softened briefly. Poor Leonard. He always did prefer tragedy to truth. They sat in silence for a moment, broken only by the faint ticking of the station clock. Purbright studied her carefully. She was poised, intelligent, and, he suspected, far too aware of her own effect on people. "Miss Darnell," he said, "your return will create what we in Flaxborough call a moral readjustment. It may also save Mr. Hargreaves from an unfortunate career in prison, but I should like to be quite sure of one thing. You are not, in any legal or metaphorical sense, dead." She laughed, a clear, bright sound that echoed oddly in the small room. "Only to Leonard, Inspector." "That will do for now," he said, rising. "I'll arrange for you to return to Flaxborough this afternoon. If possible, please try not to die again before then." By the time Purbright brought her back, the town had already reached a comfortable level of self-satisfaction about its supposed murder case. The Flaxborough Gazette's afternoon edition bore the restrained headline, "Accountant's Confession Baffles Police," and Mrs. Thistlethwaite was holding court at the tea-room, explaining to anyone within reach how she had known something dreadful was coming since the parish fete of 1959. Purbright escorted Miss Darnell directly to the station. Constable Parkin, who was polishing his boots with misguided vigor, nearly swallowed his tongue when he saw her. "Good heavens," he blurted, "you're the lady from the river." "Not quite," Purbright corrected. "The lady who wasn't in the river." He sent Parkin to fetch Hargreaves, who arrived within the hour, pale and visibly trembling. When he entered the inspector's office and saw her sitting there, he stopped as if struck. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Hargreaves' face changed, first disbelief, then a kind of grief-stricken wonder. "Evelyn," he whispered. She rose, awkwardly, her composure cracking. "Leonard, I never meant—" He cut across her softly. "You're alive." "Yes," she said, almost apologetically. "I thought you'd understand. I only needed time." Purbright, who had tactfully turned toward the window, now cleared his throat. "Well, I imagine this clarifies matters. Mr. Hargreaves, you are, it seems, innocent of murder, though you might consider yourself guilty of melodrama." There was a faint sound, half sob, half laugh, from Miss Darnell. Hargreaves looked down at his hands, which trembled slightly. "I thought I'd done something terrible," he said. "When she didn't come back, I couldn't sleep. I kept remembering her saying she'd ruin me. I believed I'd lost control, that maybe I'd... He stopped. Purbright nodded sympathetically. Imagination, Mr. Hargreaves, is a dangerous faculty in the unpracticed. You used it unsupervised. Hargreaves managed a weak smile. Miss Darnell's eyes filled briefly with tears, quickly suppressed. I should have written, she murmured. It was cruel to leave like that. Yes, Purbright said, still looking out the window, but cruelty in Flaxborough, Miss Darnell, seldom carries a prison sentence. Merely conversation? Outside, the rain had begun again, thin and persistent. The inspector turned back to them. I shall make a brief report, largely consisting of apologies to my superiors and condolences to the Gazette. Mr. Hargreaves, you may go home. Miss Darnell, I suggest you avoid the Rose and Crown for a day or two. The clientele is easily excited. They left together, awkwardly side by side, their silence thick with unsaid things. Purbright watched them through the glass door until they vanished into the drizzle. He sat for a while, pen idle in his hand, considering the curious machinery of conscience that could make a man believe he had killed a woman simply by imagining her absence. In its own way, it was as revealing as any crime. But something still troubled him. Why had the handbag been buried? Why had Hargreaves, in his confusion, gone to such pains to hide what he might simply have discarded? There was, he thought, one part of this tidy little mystery that remained untidy. He took up his hat once more. It was time, perhaps, to ask a few questions of those who claimed to know nothing. Purbright walked slowly, back through the dim corridor of the police station, his hands folded behind him, head slightly bent as though listening to the echo of his own thoughts. It was not, he reflected, in his nature to distrust appearances merely for the pleasure of doing so. Yet when an affair in Flaxborough seemed perfectly concluded, it was generally because someone wished it to appear so. The case of Leonard Hargreaves, neat, harmless, and recently acquitted by circumstance, fitted that pattern with unnerving precision. He returned to his office, where the faint smell of tobacco and damp paper lent an air of habitual patience. The handbag lay once more on his desk. He regarded it for a long moment before opening the clasp. The contents were as before: the compact, the handkerchief, the locket containing Hargreaves's unflattering likeness. But now, looking closer, Purbright noticed something new. Beneath the lining, a small corner of folded paper protruded, barely visible, as though pressed there by accident. He drew it out carefully. It was a pawn ticket, faintly smudged but legible. Haversby Loan and Pledge Office, gold bracelet, E. Darnell. The date was from 3 weeks earlier. So Miss Darnell had not vanished into romantic despair, but into modest financial difficulty. It lent a sharper light to her tale of sudden departure. Purbright smiled faintly. "Freedom," he murmured, "is expensive in installments." He placed the ticket back and rang for Parkin. The constable arrived, brushing crumbs from his sleeve. "Parkin," said Purbright, "would you be so good as to make discreet inquiries at the Haversby pawnshop listed here? I should like to know whether Miss Darnell redeemed her bracelet, or whether someone else did." Parkin examined the ticket as if it were evidence of sorcery. "Right away, sir. Do you want me to mention her name?" "Only if it produces results," Purbright replied. "Otherwise, let the man assume you're the sentimental friend of a forgetful lady." Parkin left, looking alarmed at the assignment's social demands. Purbright spent the afternoon rereading his notes. The entire business of the confession still bothered him. Guilt without crime was not unusual. Flaxborough possessed a plentiful supply of people who could feel remorse over another person's headache. But burying a handbag, burying anything, suggested more than confusion. It suggested concealment. As dusk settled, Parkin returned, damp and triumphant. "He remembered her, sir. Said she pawned it herself. But here's the thing. 3 days later, A man came in and tried to redeem it using her ticket. The pawnbroker refused, naturally. Said the fellow was polite but insistent. Wouldn't give his name. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. And this man's description? Tallish, thin, fair hair, respectable suit. Pawnbroker thought he was a clerk. Of course he did, said Purbright softly. They always do. He reached for his coat again. Come along, Parkin. We'll take a short evening stroll. It's time to revisit Mr. Hargreaves. St. Luke's Terrace lay quiet, the sort of street that looked ashamed of having been noticed. Lights glowed behind curtains, and somewhere a wireless murmured a weather report. When Purbright knocked, Hargreaves answered promptly, his face drawn but expectant. "Inspector," he said, attempting calm. "I thought it was all settled." "Matters of conscience rarely are," Purbright replied pleasantly. "May we come in?" The house was immaculate, though the air had that stale tang of sleeplessness. On the table lay a teapot, untouched, beside a neat stack of ledgers, an accountant's comfort. "I won't keep you long," Purbright said. "There's just one curiosity I'd like to resolve. You told me you buried Miss Darnell's handbag because you believed she was dead, yet you made no effort to destroy it. Why keep it at all?" Hargreaves hesitated. "I don't know. It seemed wrong to throw it away. She'd said it meant something to her. I thought if anyone found it, they'd blame me." "Understandable," said Purbright, his tone almost kind. "And yet you later went to Haversby, didn't you, to try to redeem her bracelet?" The colour drained from Hargreaves' face. "How did you—" He stopped, realizing. Purbright's expression didn't change. "You see, guilt has a tidy mind, Mr. Hargreaves. It likes to put everything back where it belongs, even the things that never should have been taken." The man sat heavily, hands twisting together. "I only wanted to make things right," he said hoarsely. "She'd pawned it because of me. Money troubles, you understand. I thought if I got it back, it might make amends." "Amends for what?" Purbright asked quietly. "For losing my temper that night. I pushed her. She fell, hit the table. She ran out crying. I thought I'd killed her. There was blood on the floor." Parkin stiffened, but Purbright only inclined his head. "Blood?" "Yes, a cut on her forehead. I wiped it up. Afterwards I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice, seeing her lying there. When I buried the handbag, it was like burying what I'd done." Purbright studied him for a long moment. "You see now why Miss Darnell might not have hurried back?" Hargreaves' shoulders sagged. "Yes, I never meant harm. I just wanted it over." When they left the house, the night was cool and clear. Parkin, silent for several yards, finally spoke. "So it was just that then. A quarrel, a bit of blood, no real crime." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "but we're not finished. A man who buries guilt so carefully may yet have company in the grave. Someone else knew enough to direct our attention to that handbag, Parkin, and I'd rather like to know who." They walked on, the inspector's pace slow, reflective. The lamps shone on wet cobbles, casting their small halos like cautious confessions. Somewhere in the darkness, Flaxborough stirred, listening. The following morning began with that deceptive stillness particular to Flaxborough, an air of calm that seemed to hide its own curiosity behind drawn curtains. Inspector Purbright, whose breakfast was seldom accompanied by appetite, sat in his office contemplating the curious problem of the buried handbag and the invisible hand that had guided its discovery. Someone, he was sure, had nudged events just enough to turn a private guilt into a public spectacle. Parkin, punctual and slightly breathless, entered bearing a tray of tea that looked nervous to be there. "Morning, sir. The papers have it all in again. Says you've solved the murder that wasn't." "Good," said Purbright, not looking up. "When the press feels clever, it stops asking for statements." He took the cup and added, "What does it say about Miss Darnell?" Calls her a tragic figure. Says she's gone to stay with an aunt in Ely. Mind, it doesn't say whether the aunt knows. Ah. Purbright sipped, then set the cup down carefully. And what does it say about Mr. Hargreaves? Parkin hesitated. That he's been exonerated by the discovery of the living lady, though Mrs. Thistlethwaite told the Gazette she still wasn't satisfied in her own mind. Mrs. Thistlethwaite's mind, murmured Purbright, has never been what you'd call a secure premises. He rose, pacing to the window. Outside, the street shimmered faintly under drizzle. Still, Parkin, I can't shake the feeling that our little drama had a prompter behind the scenes. Someone wanted the handbag found. Parkin frowned. You mean Mr. Codd? He dug it up. Yes, but only because someone made sure he would. The bag was buried on the edge of his plot, far enough to escape notice, but not far enough to escape curiosity. And curiosity, in Mr. Codd's case, is an occupational hazard. Then who, sir? That, said Purbright, is what we shall discover. We'll begin with those who might benefit from a scandal involving the Municipal Accounts Office. By mid-morning, Purbright and Parkin were seated in the council chamber, facing the clerk to the borough council, a man named Hopwood whose thin moustache trembled whenever he was addressed directly. Nothing irregular about Hargreaves, Hopwood insisted, his voice like sandpaper on silk. Model of punctuality, very tidy with decimals. The only complaint I ever heard was that he sharpened his pencils too loudly. Purbright smiled faintly. You never noticed any resentment toward him among the staff? Well, Hopwood coughed delicately. There was some unpleasantness over the recreation fund last year. A dispute about an audit. Hargreaves claimed certain disbursements weren't properly documented. He made rather a nuisance of himself. Whose disbursements? Hopwood gave a pained look. Councillor Liversedge, as treasurer of the committee. But it was all settled amicably. Meaning quietly, said Purbright. Quite so. Outside, Parkin looked impressed. You think Liversedge planted the handbag? I think Liversedge is the sort of man who would bury anything, except his own mistakes. They visited the councillor that afternoon. Liversedge lived in a large, respectable house that smelt faintly of disinfectant and municipal ambition. He greeted them with the heavy bonhomie of a man who resents being interrupted but wishes to appear civic. My dear Inspector, what a surprise! Come about our new pedestrian crossing, have you? Not today, Councillor, said Purbright mildly. I'm revisiting the Hargreaves affair. The man's smile faltered. Oh, that. Shocking business. Well, almost business. But all cleared up now, I understand? Nearly, said Purbright. One detail remains uncertain. The handbag. It seems odd that it should have been found so conveniently. Liversedge chuckled, but it lacked conviction. These things happen. Gardeners and gossip. Two institutions that unearth more than the police. Indeed, Purbright replied, letting the silence lengthen. You and Mr. Hargreaves had dealings over council accounts, I believe. Routine matters only. The man was meticulous to a fault, always prying, questioning figures that didn't need explaining. Yet, said Purbright softly, he never accused you of anything improper. Liversedge's smile returned, but not to his eyes. Because there was nothing to accuse me of, Inspector? I'm sure, said Purbright, rising. Still, if you should recall anything that might clarify how that handbag came to rest in Mr. Codd's plot, do let me know. They left him standing in the hall, his affability congealed. On the drive back, Parkin said, he looked rattled. Yes, said Purbright, though not necessarily guilty. Rattled men are often simply unused to being observed. They passed the river, grey and swollen. The inspector watched it thoughtfully. Parkin, I'd like you to do something dull but instructive. Go through the minutes of the Recreation Fund meetings last year. See who proposed, seconded, and approved each expenditure. Parkin groaned. All of them, sir. Every tedious penny, Purbright said. I'll be in my office. trying to remember whether Flaxborough ever contained an innocent coincidence. By evening, Parkin returned with a sheaf of notes. "I think you were right, sir. The fund paid out £50 for decorative improvements to the pavilion, signed off by Liversedge, but there's no receipt attached." Purbright nodded slowly. £50, you say? About the same sum Miss Darnell might have required. To redeem a gold bracelet, perhaps, if one wished to buy her silence, for instance. Parkin blinked. "You mean she was mixed up in it?" "Possibly not by choice. A charming woman, down on her luck, acquainted with a man who knew too much. That's a formula even Flaxborough's arithmetic can't resist." He stood, gazing out at the rain-smeared window. Somewhere, faintly, the town clock struck 8. "Parkin," he said quietly, "it seems our scandal was never about murder at all. It was about money, buried just as carefully and nearly as deep." The constable hesitated. "So what now, sir?" Purbright's voice was almost gentle. "Now, Parkin, we wait for guilt to do what it always does in Flaxborough." "What's that, sir?" He smiled faintly. "Come calling, after dark." The following night unfolded with the quiet precision Flaxborough reserved for gossip that had outstayed its welcome. The rain had cleared but left behind a damp residue that hung in the air like unfinished business. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk with a pipe he rarely lit and a mind he rarely rested, found his thoughts circling the same pattern. Leonard Hargreaves's confession, the buried handbag, Miss Darnell's abrupt disappearance and equally abrupt resurrection, and Councillor Liversedge's polite unease. Each piece was credible on its own. Together, they formed something just a little too neat for comfort. The telephone rang shortly before 9. Purbright answered it with his habitual calm, though calm in Flaxborough was merely a polite disguise for curiosity. The voice was Miss Darnell's, faintly breathless, as though she had made the decision to call only after much hesitation. "Inspector," she said, "I'm sorry to trouble you, but there's someone outside my lodging. I've seen him twice tonight. He's just standing across the street by the lamp-post." "Do you recognize him?" "No, though I have a feeling I should. He doesn't move, just watches." I thought perhaps you ought to know." Purbright's tone was mild. "Quite right, Miss Darnell. Stay indoors, keep the curtains drawn, and don't open the door to anyone. I'll send someone immediately." He hung up and called for Parkin, who appeared with his usual air of having been surprised by responsibility. "Take the car, Parkin. Go to Miss Darnell's lodgings on High Street, number 16. Walk from the corner, quietly, and see who's playing sentry outside. Don't approach unless you have to. Just observe and report." Parkin nodded and vanished. Purbright leaned back, eyes half closed. A watcher outside a woman's window was either a fool or a conscience, and he was curious to know which Flaxborough had provided tonight. Half an hour later, Parkin returned, cheeks flushed from the damp air. "I saw him, sir, standing just where she said, by the lamp-post. Tall man, light coat, but when he spotted me, he walked off sharpish. I followed as far as the bridge, but he disappeared into the alley behind the brewery." Purbright considered this. "You didn't get a look at his face?" "Only a bit. Looked familiar, though. Might have been Councillor Liversedge, but I wouldn't swear to it." Purbright gave a small nod, as if to say that the world, being small, often obliges with coincidence. "Very well. We'll leave Miss Darnell in peace for the night. Tomorrow, however, I think the councillor should be reminded that curiosity near women's lodgings can be misinterpreted." The following morning found Liversedge already in his office, flanked by papers arranged to suggest both industry and innocence. Purbright entered with his hat in hand, and a civility that made most men nervous. "I shan't keep you long, councillor. It's merely a matter of civic curiosity. Were you by any chance on High Street last night?" Liversedge blinked. "High Street? No, certainly not. I was at home, reading minutes for tomorrow's meeting." "Ah, then the minutes will serve as your alibi, no doubt. An admirable habit. I beg your pardon? Purbright smiled faintly. It's just that someone matching your description was seen loitering near a certain house there, a house presently occupied by Miss Evelyn Darnell. The counsellor's expression hardened. Miss Darnell, that woman has caused enough embarrassment already. If she's spreading tales? On the contrary, Purbright interrupted gently. She made no accusations, only a report of unease. You see, in Flaxborough, even unease tends to take on civic importance. Liversedge exhaled sharply through his nose, then said, Inspector, I've had enough of this nonsense. Hargreaves was a neurotic fool, the woman's a schemer, and if they wish to destroy each other, I suggest they do so privately. Purbright regarded him with mild sympathy. I quite agree, Counsellor, yet it would be unwise, I think, for you to appear publicly connected with either. He paused, especially when the Recreation Fund records for last year are, how shall we say, a little lacking in arithmetic modesty. For the first time, Liversedge's composure cracked. His eyes darted to the papers on his desk, then back to the inspector. You've been through those? I tried to keep my sums balanced, Purbright said pleasantly. But rest easy, no public charges. Not yet, at least. When he left, Liversedge's hand trembled visibly as he reached for his cigarette case. Back at the station, Parkin was waiting with news. Letter came for you, sir. No return address. Posted last night. Purbright opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing just 5 words in uneven handwriting. Ask her about the money. He folded it, placed it neatly in his pocket, and said, Well, Parkin, it seems the plot thickens not from murder, but from mathematics. That evening, Purbright paid Miss Darnell another visit. She looked strained, her poise beginning to fray under the town's scrutiny. He accepted a cup of tea and let silence do its usual work. At last, she said, You've spoken to Leonard? Yes, he's calmer now. But there's still one thing troubling me. The bracelet. You pawned it for cash, yet you told me it was sentimental. Her eyes flickered. It was, until sentiment stopped paying the rent. And the £50 you received afterward. From Counsellor Liversedge. She froze. For several seconds, the room seemed to shrink. How do you... Purbright's voice was gentle. He withdrew the same sum from the Recreation Fund that week. I imagine it was intended as gratitude for your silence. Her breath caught, then steadied. I didn't ask for it. He offered, said it was a private settlement. I took it. I needed the money. I didn't know he'd taken it from public funds until later. And then? I told Leonard, she said softly. He said he'd expose Liversedge. That was the night we fought. Purbright nodded slowly, everything aligning with quiet inevitability. So that was the crime you both tried to bury, his guilt, your silence, and the counsellor's theft. She looked at him, half pleading, half resigned. It's over now, isn't it? Purbright stood, his tone mild but final. In Flaxborough, Miss Darnell, nothing is ever quite over. It simply becomes less talked about. As he stepped into the night, he saw a solitary figure across the street, Liversedge again, watching the same window. This time, Purbright did not call out. He merely observed, patient and still, as the counsellor turned away, disappearing into the mist that seemed to carry the whole town's secrets on its breath. The next morning brought a brittle kind of sunshine that looked as though it had been borrowed from another, more cheerful town. Inspector Purbright, who disliked weather that pretended optimism, found it a poor companion for contemplation. He sat at his desk, rereading his notes with the methodical patience of a man untangling thread from a drawer that had been left too long closed. Each name, Hargreaves, Darnell, Liversedge, formed its own little knot, and between them ran the invisible strands of money, shame, and misplaced affection. At 9:30, Parkin entered carrying a stack of correspondence. Morning, sir. There's a letter from the borough office. They'd like a word about the recreation fund matter. Purbright raised an eyebrow. Would they indeed? I imagine the councillors are discovering that arithmetic, unlike politics, can't be amended by vote. Also, Parkin continued, there's been some trouble outside Miss Darnell's lodgings again. Mrs. Pottle from the greengrocer's says she saw someone arguing with her in the doorway last night. Couldn't see who, it was dark, but said the man had a hat on. Purbright's tone was dry. That does narrow the field. Parkin hesitated. Mrs. Pottle thought she heard Miss Darnell crying, said it sounded like the end of a quarrel, not the start. The inspector nodded, though his expression betrayed neither surprise nor satisfaction. Thank you, Parkin. I shall call on her this morning before the council remembers it has a conscience. High Street was already alive with the discreet bustle of a town that thrived on watching its neighbours. When Purbright arrived at number 16, Miss Darnell answered promptly but looked strained. Her eyes had that glassy brightness of someone determined to appear composed after tears. Inspector, she said, stepping aside. I suppose someone's told you. They have a gift for it, he replied gently. Who was it, Miss Darnell? She hesitated, then sighed. Liversedge. He came late. Said he wanted to talk things over. He'd been drinking, I think. Said I'd ruined his reputation, that the whole town was whispering. He wanted me to leave Flaxborough for good. Did he threaten you? Not directly. Just reminded me I'd taken his money. Said if I made trouble, he'd tell everyone why. Purbright studied her. Did he mention the missing recreation funds? Her eyes flicked up sharply. He said no one would believe me if I did. And perhaps he's right. You know what this town is like, Inspector. A man like him can do what he pleases, so long as his wife sits in the front pew and his garden wins prizes. Purbright smiled faintly. A sound description of Flaxborough's social contract. He paused. You've nothing to fear from him now, Miss Darnell. The facts have a way of emerging when least convenient. She looked away. I wish that comforted me. When he left her, the street outside seemed quieter than usual, though the stillness carried its own sort of watchfulness. He crossed to the post office, where Mrs. Hockley greeted him with eager solemnity. Inspector, I don't like to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing Councillor Liversedge sending a telegram yesterday evening. To London it was urgent, he said. Looked very flustered. Purbright thanked her, made a note, and returned to the station. There, he found Parkin once again trying to look busy with a newspaper. Sir, the constable said quickly, we've just had a message from the vicar. Says he found something behind the churchyard wall this morning. A briefcase. Nameplate says E. Liversedge. Purbright's expression didn't change, though his eyes sharpened slightly. Did the vicar happen to open it? No, sir. Said he thought it best to leave it to us. Quite right. He rose and reached for his coat. Come along, Parkin. Let's not keep the clergy in suspense. The churchyard was damp and faintly fragrant with cut grass. Reverend Nibbleswick awaited them, by the wall, a thin, nervous man who seemed perpetually surprised by sin. It was there when I came to unlock the vestry, Inspector, he said, gesturing to a leather case half hidden under ivy. I didn't like to touch it. It looked official. Purbright knelt, brushing away leaves. The lock had been forced. Inside were several papers, a bank book, and a single envelope marked "Private to be opened, only in the event of my death." Well, murmured Purbright, the councillor appears to have been rehearsing. He glanced through the bank statements. The figures were clear enough. Withdrawals matching those in the recreation fund records, transferred through an intermediary account. One note, scribbled in a hasty hand, read simply, she said she'd tell the papers. I can't let that happen. Parkin looked uneasy. You think he meant Miss Darnell? Who else, Parkin? Conscience again, though in Flaxborough it usually arrives with an overdraft. By evening, the councillor's whereabouts were the town's newest topic. His car had been found abandoned near the riverbank, door open, the driver's seat empty. A hat floated in the reeds. Purbright stood at the water's edge as dusk closed in, the air smelling faintly of mud and inevitability. Parkin shifted beside him, uncomfortable. "You think he's done himself in, sir?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps he's playing at it. Men like Liversedge seldom do anything unpleasant without witnesses." They watched the slow ripple of the current. A faint metallic gleam caught Purbright's eye among the reeds. A wristwatch, half buried in silt. He picked it up, turning it in his hand. The initials on the back read E.L. "Send for the boat hook, Parkin," he said quietly. "If our counsellor wished to vanish tidily, I fear the river has been less cooperative than usual." As constables moved to fetch equipment, Purbright remained still, his gaze on the water's slow surface. The pattern was complete now: guilt, blackmail, exposure, and flight, each one as inevitable as gossip after church. Yet he suspected the story was not quite finished. There was always, in Flaxborough, one last whisper waiting for the right moment to be heard. By dawn the next morning, a light mist hung over the river like a veil reluctant to lift. Inspector Purbright stood on the bank, coat collar turned up, watching as the constables worked the dragging lines with patient futility. A heron stalked nearby, apparently more competent at its search than the assembled police. After an hour, the men pulled up nothing more incriminating than an old bicycle frame and a shoe that no one wished to claim. Purbright looked down the slow-moving water. It reflected a sky that was trying to forget the night. He was not convinced Liversedge had ended his life in it. The counsellor, he thought, was too well acquainted with municipal procedure to mislay himself without a plan for retrieval. Parkin, standing beside him with an expression of earnest discomfort, said, "If he's in there, sir, the current would have taken him further downstream by now." "Indeed," said Purbright mildly, "but my suspicion is that Councillor Liversedge preferred dry land for his vanishing acts. Water, while useful for washing away sins, is an unreliable accomplice." They walked back toward the waiting car, the road slick underfoot. Purbright's gaze wandered to the hedgerow, where a torn scrap of paper fluttered from a bramble. He caught it absently and glanced at the print. It was a portion of a telegram form, the same pink as the one Mrs. Hockley had described. Only a few words remained visible. "Arriving noon. Papers. Cannot delay." He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "Parkin," he said, "fetch Miss Darnell to the station when you can do so discreetly. I should like a quiet word before our missing man decides whether to reappear as a corpse or a penitent." Miss Darnell arrived just after 10, composed but pale, her elegance slightly diminished by sleeplessness. Purbright offered her tea, which she accepted without enthusiasm. "Miss Darnell," he began, "I imagine you've heard about Councillor Liversedge's disappearance." Her eyes flickered. "They said he drowned. They said many things. I prefer evidence to rumor." He paused. "Did you see him again after your quarrel?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around the teacup. "Yes, yesterday afternoon. He came to the lodging house again. Said he wanted to make peace. He seemed different, frightened almost. He told me he'd sent for someone in London. A solicitor, I think. Said it would put things right." Then he left. Purbright nodded slowly. "Did he mention what precisely was to be put right?" "No, but he gave me this." She reached into her handbag and produced a small envelope. Inside was a single key and a note in Liversedge's careful handwriting. "Locker 19. You'll understand when the time comes." Purbright examined the key, then looked at her thoughtfully. "You've done the sensible thing by bringing it to me. I imagine the time he mentions has arrived somewhat earlier than intended." He stood, took his coat, and gestured to Parkin. "The station, Parkin. Railway, not police. I think our counsellor left us a little legacy. Locker 19 yielded to the key with a reluctant click. Inside lay a brown envelope, thick with documents and a small cloth bag tied with string. Purbright opened the bag first. It contained several gold coins and a pair of earrings, old-fashioned, valuable, unmistakably belonging to Miss Darnell. He handed them to her. "Your property, I believe." She stared. "He must have taken them when I left him. I never even realized." Purbright turned to the envelope. Inside were typed statements, correspondence, and receipts. The entire sordid account of the recreation, funds diversions, traced through shell accounts and fictitious expenses. One letter, unsigned but typed on municipal stationery, referred to payments to be managed discreetly and Miss Darnell's cooperation as previously agreed. Parkin whistled softly. "He kept the evidence himself, sir." "Why would he do that?" "Because guilt," said Purbright, "is a meticulous bookkeeper. It likes everything documented." He folded the papers again. This was his insurance, or perhaps his confession. Miss Darnell's composure began to waver. "Then he's ruined," she whispered. "Even if he's alive, he can't face that." Purbright looked at her with quiet sympathy. "A man like Liversedge rarely fears punishment, Miss Darnell. He fears humiliation. It's much the same, but rather less dignified." As they stepped out of the station, the town itself seemed to lean closer. News of the councillor's disappearance had reached saturation. Even the pigeons on the war memorial appeared to have opinions. Mrs. Thistlethwaite, encountering Purbright outside the post office, greeted him with an expression of pained virtue. "So dreadful, Inspector. But I always said he was too genial. Men who are too genial usually have something to hide." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "And they usually find it again when no one is looking." By mid-afternoon, a report came from the next town. Liversedge's car had been seen near the railway siding late the previous night, and a ticket clerk remembered a man matching his description boarding the early train for London. It appeared the counsellor had chosen exile over repentance. Purbright received the news with mild satisfaction. "There we are, Parkin. A drowning without a corpse, a confession without a courtroom, and a scandal with just enough respectability to be forgotten in a month." "You mean he's gone for good, sir?" "For good," said Purbright, "is a moral judgment. Let's say for distance." He returned to his office, where the late sunlight slanted through the blinds. On his desk lay the recovered documents, the key, and a single remaining telegram scrap. Together they told a story as tidy as any in Flaxborough, a tale of impropriety politely disguised until conscience, love, and arithmetic conspired to reveal it. Still, one loose thread remained. The anonymous note. Ask her about the money. Who had sent it? Not Liversedge. His guilt had been too personal. Not Hargreaves, who lacked the guile. Perhaps someone who had watched the affair unfold from a distance, amused or resentful. Purbright leaned back, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. In Flaxborough, he thought, there was always at least one observer who preferred suggestion to statement. The town survived on such subtleties. Outside, the bells of St. Luke's began to ring for evening service, their sound both comforting and faintly admonitory. Purbright rose, turned off the desk lamp, and looked once more at the folded envelope marked private. He wondered briefly if the counsellor had meant it for posterity or protection. Either way, it would rest now in the station safe. Flaxborough's newest secret, preserved with all the others, waiting for the next scandal to nudge it into conversation once more. Evening settled over Flaxborough with the weary dignity of a town that had once again survived its own morality. The streets were washed clean by a late drizzle, and the air held that faint smell of damp earth and coal smoke that always seemed to follow a scandal toward its conclusion. In the police station, Inspector Purbright sat before a cold pot of tea, reviewing the final notes of the case. He had written the words, Liver Sedge believed absconded with a neatness that implied a certain generosity of imagination. The councillor's flight to London had been confirmed by the railway clerk and an observant porter, but beyond that, the trail ended in anonymity, a condition that suited both the fugitive and Flaxborough perfectly. Parkin entered, his uniform slightly crooked from haste. "Evening, sir. Thought you'd like to know. Miss Darnell's leaving. Caught the 6 o'clock coach. Said she wanted to start somewhere new." Purbright nodded. A commendable ambition, though Flaxborough rarely lets people start anything entirely new. It prefers sequels. She looked relieved, sir, almost cheerful. "Good. Guilt shared is half the weight, and she's been carrying more than her share. Mr. Hargreaves will recover soon enough. He's the sort of man who finds comfort in reconciled ledgers." Parkin hesitated. "And what about Liver Sedge? Will you send the papers to London?" Purbright smiled faintly. "In due course. But for now, the Borough Council would rather forget the entire matter than risk a headline. They'll appoint a committee to review accounting practices and congratulate themselves on transparency. As for the councillor, London's large enough to swallow small sins whole." Parkin gave a reluctant grin. "Suppose that's justice in its way." "Justice, Parkin," said Purbright, "is a word we use when we can't afford revenge." The constable nodded thoughtfully and withdrew. Purbright remained seated, the quiet around him deepening into that peculiar stillness that follows the unraveling of human folly. He opened the top drawer of his desk and withdrew the anonymous note. Ask her about the money. He had kept it aside, a small reminder that even in the neatest cases, someone always watched from the wings. He studied the handwriting again. Rounded, careful, written with the earnest precision of someone unused to deceit. Then, after a moment, he reached for another paper, the report from the pawnbroker at Haversby. The handwriting on the pawn ticket was identical. A slow, wry smile touched his lips. "Well," he murmured, "Flaxborough does love to tidy its stories." The pawnbroker's assistant, a young man with ambitions beyond the counter, had recognized both Hargreaves and Miss Darnell. He'd also recognized Liver Sedge when he tried to redeem the bracelet. 3 visits, 3 guilty faces, 1 curious clerk. Purbright had wondered who might have decided the matter needed a push. Now it seemed the young man had sent the note anonymously, part moral impulse, part curiosity, and perhaps a touch of mischief. Purbright leaned back in his chair. The truth, then, was perfectly banal. 3 lives entangled, 1 conscience pricked, 1 letter written, and the machinery of justice set politely in motion. That was the essence of Flaxborough crime, not passion, not violence, but embarrassment made public. Outside, the rain had ceased. The window reflected the faint shimmer of the street lamps, their light soft and yellow like old paper. Purbright stood and stretched, glancing once more at the files before closing them with deliberate care. Another case, not quite a tragedy, but enough to remind the town that respectability was only a matter of who spoke first. He crossed to the window, watching the street below. Mrs. Thistlethwaite passed by, wrapped in moral superiority and a new raincoat, no doubt on her way to inform the vicar of the latest developments. A cat followed her, silent and indifferent, the only truly innocent creature in Flaxborough. Purbright smiled faintly. It struck him that, for all its gossip and sanctimony, the town possessed a curious mercy. Scandal never truly destroyed anyone. It merely reshaped their place in the social order. By next month, Leonard Hargreaves would be reinstated at the municipal office, quieter and a little sadder. Miss Darnell would be a story retold in lowered voices. And Liver Sedge, well, London was full of men who had once been respected councillors. He turned back to his desk, extinguished the lamp, and picked up his hat. The air outside was cool and clean, the rain's aftertaste sharp on the cobbles. As he locked the station door behind him, he glanced toward the river, faintly visible through the mist. Its surface was smooth again, indifferent, carrying away whatever small fragments of conscience and consequence had been cast into it. Purbright walked home with his usual unhurried step, pausing once to light his pipe. The match flared briefly, then died, leaving only the faintest trace of smoke curling into the night. He thought of Hargreaves's trembling confession in the Rose and Crown, of Miss Darnell's desperate elegance, and of Liversedge's neat handwriting on the envelope marked "Private." Each had acted, he supposed, out of a desire to protect themselves, yet in doing so had contrived to expose precisely what they wished to hide. It was, he reflected, the most consistent law of human nature. At his gate, he paused, looking back at the dim lights of the town. The bells from St. Luke's struck the eye to hour, measured, implacable, as if counting the distance between one scandal and the next. Purbright smiled, faintly but sincerely, and went inside. Tomorrow there would be new paperwork, new whispers, and perhaps even a new confession, something less dramatic, more domestic. The constable would bring him tea. The town would carry on pretending that nothing unpleasant ever really happened in Flaxborough. And somewhere, behind lace curtains and moral certainty, someone would already be rehearsing the next apology. Purbright sat at his desk once more, opened his ledger, and began to write the final line of his report. The pen moved with quiet authority, leaving behind the last trace of the affair that had so politely disturbed the peace. When he had finished, he set the pen down, closed the file, and leaned back, allowing himself a moment of stillness. Outside, the church bells ceased, and all of Flaxborough, for once, seemed to hold its breath.